suppository, the first shot rings out. No one knows exactly what it is yet, but the Secret Service agent sitting in the front of the car, Rufus Youngblood, yells out, "Get down, get down." Then he grabs Johnson by the shoulder like this and pulls him down onto the floor of the car.
世界現象に対する暗殺といえば、最も知られている暗殺の一つは、ケネディ大統領に対する暗殺です。彼が暗殺された理由、彼を暗殺した人などに対して、未だに多くの議論が行われています。今回は、ケネディ大統領の暗殺とも関係性があるドキュメンタリーを紹介します。彼が暗殺された後、第36代目大統領になったリンドン・ジョンソン大統領の話です。今回皆さんに紹介する動画は、どちらかというと、彼を高く評価する動画ではありません。普段あまり見ない一面を紹介する動画ですので、違う視点を得ることができるかもしれません。では、どうぞ。
Lyndon Johnson's first public words as president, a few hours after his swearing in.
We have suffered a loss that cannot be waived. I will do my best. That is all I can do.
He'd wanted this job all his adult life, but the moment he got it, he knew the day would forever be remembered as marking the end of another man's presidency, not the beginning of his own. This is the story of the man in the other Lincoln convertible gliding fatefully toward Dealey Plaza, November 22nd, 1963. The story of a life truly changed in an instant. It was a very unusual thing for the Vice President and the President of the United States to be traveling together in the same motorcade. But there Johnson was, sitting exactly where I'm sitting in a car that's almost exactly like the one that he was in on that day. The car that carried Vice President Lyndon Johnson through the streets of Dallas was one of a million reminders that he, who had once been among the most powerful men in the country, was now, in his own opinion, a nobody, washed up. The car was a Lincoln like the president's, but Johnson's Lincoln was a rental. And it didn't get any better as he looked up the road and all he could see were the throngs that had turned out. Bigger crowds than anyone had expected, but crowds that were turning out to see John F. Kennedy, Johnson's political rival, the man he believes had taken away not just the nomination for the presidency in 1960, but perhaps his last best chance ever to become the President of the United States.
And my colleagues, including Senator Kennedy and Senator Symington and 62 other beloved Democrats, had selected me as their leader.
Johnson had underestimated Kennedy in 1960, underestimated the appeal of his youth, his charm, his grace, his political savvy, but most of all, the power of his dad's money. Johnson had thought the Democratic nomination would fall to him naturally because of his stature as the most powerful Senate Majority Leader in history. He was wrong. Kennedy won it on the first ballot. Before the convention ended, though, Johnson had made the most important decision of his life. He'd accepted Kennedy's offer to be the vice presidential candidate. He'd made a carefully considered calculation. He'd asked his staff to research how often a vice president becomes president.
As they appeared to have received a late president.
Jeffrey Engel is a presidential scholar at the Southern Methodist University in Dallas. He studied Johnson's rise and fall as president.
About 1 in 5 of American presidents did not complete their term, that they died during office. And so he very candidly says to friends, you know, these are not great odds, but these might be the best odds I'm ever going to get.
When Bobby Kennedy finds out that Johnson will be on the ticket with his brother, he's horrified, and he tries to stop it. Johnson knows this, and their mutual hatred becomes the enduring blood feud of their lives.
Bobby Kennedy embodied everything that Johnson was not and Johnson despised. He was rich, he was good looking, he was full of intellectual fervor.
Kennedy wins the White House in one of the narrowest elections in history, and almost 2/3 of his winning margin comes from Lyndon Johnson's Texas. But the vice presidency is a miserable experience. Johnson quickly learns that he has no power except what the president gives him, and that is almost nothing. Worse, he is a thing of ridicule in Kennedy's glamorous and sophisticated Washington.
They call him names. Rufus Cornpone, they call him.
Listen, people call each other names all the time, but that one I think is particularly important because that they are essentially deriding where he comes from. He is not a sophisticated gentleman in their view. He's not to the manner born as they had been.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only...
As Johnson follows Kennedy's car into Dealey Plaza, he has reason to believe his political career is over. There are rumors that Kennedy will drop him from the ticket in the next election. And some reporters and congressmen back in Washington are investigating a scandal that could tie Johnson to a kickback and bribery scheme. Just about the time that Johnson's car is going past the Texas Book Depository, the first shot rings out. No one knows exactly what it is yet, but the Secret Service agent sitting in the front of the car, Rufus Youngblood, yells out, "Get down, get down." Then he grabs Johnson by the shoulder like this and pulls him down onto the floor of the car. Remember, there are 3 people back here, so it's really, really tight. But Johnson isn't moving, even though he's got a heavy Secret Service agent on his back. He is very calm, lying on the floor, listening to the sound of the police radio talk about what's going on up ahead, and he hears he's been hit. He's been hit. That's about the president.
But apparently something is wrong here. Something is terribly wrong.
So while it was indeed a tragic day, it was precisely for a day like this that Johnson decided to seek the vice presidency in the first place.
Parkland Hospital has been advised to stand by for a severe gunshot wound.
Johnson is rushed into Parkland Hospital and taken to a room with his wife. They wait together, barely speaking. Soon Johnson's told that Kennedy is dead, and he's now president.
He died of a gunshot wound in the brain.
By the time of that official announcement, Johnson has already secretly left the hospital and is on his way to Air Force One. The only place in Dallas he now feels is safe.
Nobody knows if it's one shooter or if it's a dozen. Nobody knows if there are perhaps bands still around town who are affecting a broader coup, in which case Johnson, of course, would be a target.
Constitutionally, he's automatically the president, but Johnson wants to be sworn in before the plane leaves for Washington. He arranges this photo, making sure Jackie Kennedy is there as a signal of continuity. Back in Washington, continuity becomes the priority. The congressmen and reporters who'd been investigating Johnson for corruption drop it out of fear of losing another president in a crisis. Johnson invites all of Kennedy's cabinet to stay in their jobs, including Bobby Kennedy. And why not? They were highly competent, the best and the brightest, it was said. But he also enjoyed that the tables had turned on his tormentors.
We should not forget that he enjoyed immensely the people who had ridiculed him before now having to call him Mr. President, stand when he walked in the room, and follow his orders. Yes, they're good people for the job. Yes, they know what they're doing. Yes, continuity is important. All those reasons, I think, are 99% of it. But there's an inner smirk, I think, for Johnson from time to time.
Johnson's been called the greatest genius in the use of political power in the second half of the 20th century. He uses all of it to accomplish in a few short weeks what had stymied Kennedy for more than a year. He lays the groundwork for passing most of the Kennedy agenda, a budget, tax cuts, and most important, a civil rights bill.
ウェルスナビ、老後とか将来のお金心配だよね。
そろそろなんか考えないと。
教えてあげたいな。
He's finally embraced by his party and the country. In the November election, he wins 61% of the popular vote, something never done by a presidential candidate before or since.
64 was an extraordinary year for the Democrats, and Johnson took that as a referendum on himself, which he won.
But almost immediately, it all begins to slip away, sinking into the quicksands of Vietnam. He's expanded the war enormously. Tens of thousands of young men are drafted, and lose their lives in the jungles of a small foreign country trying to win what turns out to be unwinnable. By 1968, Johnson's worst nightmare is becoming real. His archenemy, Bobby Kennedy, a man he loathes, has sensed his vulnerability and announced he's running for president to replace Johnson.
So will you give me your vote?
Johnson, who's always feared humiliation and failure, decides not to fight.
And I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The job he'd wanted his whole adult life has turned him into a tragic figure.
The fact that he simultaneously had to deal with Vietnam is, I think, the real tragedy. That, as he described it, I'm losing the lady I love because of that bitch of a war.
Dallas had given Johnson the lady he loved. He'd used the presidency to lay the foundations of a great society, transforming American education, healthcare, civil rights, and more. But just as the end of the Kennedy presidency overshadowed the beginning of his own, so too would Kennedy's few accomplishments be more celebrated than Johnson's many. Keith Bogue, CBC News, Dallas.
これからもこのような話をしていきますので、ご興味がある方はぜひフォロー、コメント、拡散をお願いします。